is the supported researcher.
Awesome.
A lot of placental
There you go.
Thank you.
So do you work mostly here or also at children?
Huh?
They're only here.
Here, based here.
Pretty good.
I know, it's kind of nice, a little gathering. Yeah. I don't get to tell you.
I know, we gotta still do it.
It's like a birthday present.
That's a good yoga. Yeah. It's not as
That's okay. It's good that you guys went. We'll talk later. Okay.
Good afternoon. Maybe we should get started. I'm honored today to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Catherine Spong. She's a graduate of our school. She's currently chair of OBGYN at UT Southwestern Medical Center. She received her MD degree from UMKC in 1991, residency and chief resident at Harbor UCLA, then on to National Institute of Child Health and Human Development as a maternal fetal medicine fellow. Medical Associate and Senior Staff Fellow at the NIH, National Institute of Child Health and Human Development Intramural Research Program, where she directed the unit on perinatal and developmental neurobiology. In 2000, she joined NICHD's extramural program, where she had a 23-year career, culminating in roles such as Director for the Division of Extramural Research and Chief of the Pregnancy and Perinatology Branch. She has received many teaching awards and professional awards. She's an editor-in-chief of Contemporary OBGYN. She has published 300 peer-reviewed papers, and there's much more. And before I bring her up, I want to just show a few slides here. These are members of AOA that we've just recently elected. I won't read these, you can just look at them. Junior members elected just recently. These are the junior officers. Senior members from graduating here too. We usually save 2 spots for the spring of seniors that weren't elected in the fall. These are all members that were elected in the fall of 2022. Okay, and then these are the other officers. We have a resident that was elected on the left, and then the student officers that were year 5s last year elected as junior AOA, and then the faculty officers and so forth. So that's that. Please join me in welcoming our 2023 AOA visiting professor, Dr. Catherine Spong.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the kind introduction and for the opportunity to be here today to speak. Can you hear me all right? And I hope the people at St. Luke's, hello everyone at St. Luke's, give a good wave to the Flamingo, one of those little tiny brownstone apartments next door to St. Luke's. That's where I lived for a little over 4 years. And it was great when I did my ER rotation at St. Luke's because I could just walk out and walk back in. All right. So what I was hoping to do today was to give a talk that is really sort of undescribable, but hopefully will give some inspiration and will give you some things to think about kind of going forward. So I'm calling it Leveraging the Near to Create the Opportunities. I promise there is some science here, but I didn't want to just give the typical science talk because I recognize the audience is diverse and the audience is a group of people who are in different stages in your careers, and you may not care as much about OBGYN than I do. So you'll hear some OBGYN, but we're also going to talk on more broad strokes for you. I do want to thank you all for the invitation. Dr. Jackson, Dr. Foxworth, Dr. Malik, it's just great to be here, to come back to UMKC, to take, and I appreciate being we're in thesis B, right? Not in A, where I took so many QPE exams. And you know, I know that they probably don't even have them anymore, but I will tell you, you took the same test when you were a first year and when you were a 6th year. When I was a first year, I always tried to make the patient live and tried to not have them have a terrible thing. So that was my strategy kind of going forward, but I appreciate not reliving that at the moment. I don't have any conflicts of interest related to the presentation, and what I want to start with is to talk about how do you leverage opportunities? Then I want to talk about how do you get an idea, and that's something that I've heard a couple of people give talks on how to come up with ideas, and it's something that I often get asked a lot, like, I want to do research, I want to do something, and how do I get that idea? How do I know and define ideas? And then I'm going to talk about an underappreciated, simple condition, and I apologize for any of you who have heard my discussion on anemia in the past, changed it up a little bit, and how to create critical evidence for practice, even with something so mundane as anemia. All right, so before I get to begin though, I will say it's so much fun doing my job every single day because I love it, right? And so I want to encourage all of you to love what you do. Bring passion to what you do because it makes it so fun. It makes it easier to be creative, to pursue the excellence that you want to. If you're enjoying what you do, that is just so much easier. And it also makes you more motivated. It makes everyone else around you more motivated. And it allows you to leverage the near and create the opportunities. So that's just my one thing. So let's talk about leveraging opportunities. I put on the, is it the left? I think it's the left. On the left, my timeline, right? So I graduated in 1991. In 95, I graduated my residency at Harbor-UCLA. And in 98, I finished my MFM fellowship. And I was then working in a lab and doing some clinical work, and life was like really good. And I got called to the director's office at NICHD, and Dwayne Alexander, I don't know if anyone knows Dwayne Alexander anymore, he's a great man, pediatrician, director of the Institute. And he said, Kathy, I have an opportunity for you maybe. how would you like to run the maternal fetal medicine unit network? A network of 16 clinical sites across the country doing studies in obstetrics and gynecology. And I thought to myself, I'm like 2 years out of fellowship, 1 year out of fellowship. Sure, that sounds great. Maybe I'd consider that, right? And so I went and interviewed with a couple people, and I just kept working in the lab, having a good life. And about 6 months later, because everything is really slow in the government, I get this call of, oh, you're going to start, on Monday. And I'm thinking, I don't know if I even want to do that anymore, right? But I was like, okay. And so I show up on Monday, and, my father has a saying that, for me, a first day of anything is the worst day of my life because, you don't know what you're going to do, right? And I'm like, what am I doing? But what an incredible opportunity that just, it seems to me it fell into my lap. Maybe it didn't, but it felt to me that way. And we did all of these studies. I walked in, there's 16 PIs sitting around a table at quarterly steering committee meetings. All are men, actually. All are professors. They're all men at big institutions across the country. And we do all of these studies and trials that create the evidence for how we care for people. How cool is that, right? Publish it all. We stop practices because the beautiful thing about OB is that there is no evidence base, right? So we do things all the time because we think it's great, but it isn't. So we stop practices. And one of the key things to me was to ensure that anytime we had a study, this was right after the Women's Health Initiative stuff came out, and ACOG was kind of left hanging because they didn't know the results when they came out, and then they had to kind of figure out what to do. So I was lockstep with ACOG and with SMFM to say, this study's coming out. Let's start thinking about what are we going to put out for it. So super fun opportunity, great for me, and I want to encourage all of you to think about the opportunity that just kind of presents itself and consider it, because when I went to the NIH, there weren't obstetricians at the NIH. It was very rare. So it wasn't a career path that you would think about as an obstetrician. But it sure was fun. And, I know when I was a resident and one of my studies came out and was then quoted in Williams, and how excited I was that something I did was going to help care for patients. It's so fun to create that evidence, to then make a direct impact on how people are cared for and to improve their outcomes. So what I want you to do is to think about the big questions, the untouched areas, the opportunities, and the clinical questions that you face, and then study them, right? So one of them for me certainly was cesarean delivery. And when I trained 100 years ago, everything came out from below. That's what everything comes out from below, right? So it was the time when VBACs were going up, 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 and everything comes out from below. And then all of the bad things that started happening, and so then everything gets cut out, right? And the problem was the C-section rates were just going up, up, up. And what used to be the case where, if we create a case, it was like every 6 months to a year thing. It was so infrequent. It was the case that you talked about for a month. Now we get like 2 a day. It's crazy, right? Way too many C-sections. So I started thinking about how do we fix that? And we did a first pass with a consensus conference at the NIH on trying to increase vaginal birth after cesarean again. And this was in 2010. They were really going down at that point. And we knew they're safe, like in the right patient. It's absolutely safe and the right thing to do. But the political climate, the medical legal climate just could not entertain that. So then I said, okay, let's find a different angle because you got to do something about this. And so we put this group together. How can we stop the first C-section from happening? Because if you can tamper that first C-section, then you can tamper many others. So what are the big things that you're focusing on that you see, and then how do you address them? Or what's the patient come to you with, right? So I had a patient when I did sono consults at Nova Alexandria for the 20 some odd years when I was at the NIH, and I had a patient who came in as a consult where she was early in her pregnancy, and in her last pregnancy, she had a uterine rupture in a VBAC. And she got pregnant again, and her OB said to her, "You're going to die. You know, this is not safe for you to be pregnant." So she came to me asking me, "What's my risk?" And we didn't have exactly what her risk was, but I knew where to go. And the MFMU had done that big VBAC study, and we had all of that data. So then I could take all of that data from all of those births and get down to if it's an indicated repeat cesarean or an elective repeat cesarean, or if you have a trial of labor, and then did you end up in labor or not? What was your actual risk of uterine rupture? And I could give it to her. And I will tell you that she carried the pregnancy and she had a safe delivery. Yay. Okay. Ideas. Where do ideas come from? How can you generate more ideas? How can you come up with the idea that is going to be where you want to go? I don't know that I can guarantee that, I can promise all of that. But I want you to think about what you do every day as you write that order, as you take care of that patient, as you talk to that patient. Why? What is the evidence behind what are you doing? And if there isn't evidence, then create that evidence. Second, read. I'll get into that a little bit more in a minute. But read outside your specialty. For OB, it's really easy. Everyone else has way more evidence than OB. So borrow from cardiology, from radiology, from neurology. What are they doing? What are they innovating? And how can you apply that to what you do every day and what you study? And take your advances and apply them to OB/GYN. So one of the things that I have recognized has been a theme of my life has been the placenta, right? So I worked in Mahmoud Ahmed's lab for 5.5 years when I was here. It was all about the placenta. Placenta. Never really totally made that connection until I started thinking back on it, but I've always had a lot of interest in the organ, the only organ that we can grow and discard and grow again and discard again. And we've all been attached to it at least once. It is such a neglected thing, right? It is the afterbirth. Like, how boring is that? And you can't really study it across pregnancy, although we know the fetus grows and changes across pregnancy, and the placenta grows and changes across pregnancy, but we just study it at the end of its life when it comes out. So now I was at the NICHD, and I was the deputy director, and Alan Guttmacher was the director. He was like, we need a signature something, right? March of Dimes was trying to deal with preterm birth, and let me tell you, preterm birth it's hard. And I was like, well, how about the placenta? No one cares about it, but it functions as so many organs. If we could understand it, it would be amazing, right? It removes waste, like the kidneys. It can make hormones. It provides oxygenation and nutrition. I mean, it's so cool. And it invades like a cancer. So if you could understand how that happens, how it invades into the decidua and then stops invading, the differences we could make for tumor biology, right? So what are things, how about the human placenta? And so we launched the Human Placenta Project. And I said, okay, well, how are we going to study the placenta in real time and understand how it changes, how it functions, how it grows, how it works, its metabolism across gestation in real time? And I was initially like, oh, I got a lot of naysayers, like this is never going to happen, right? You can't biopsy, you can't do anything in pregnancy. This is never, ever going to happen. And I'm like, but then we have the brain initiative. It's another organ that you really can't just like go in and biopsy and they have all these things. So they had launched a couple of years before we did. And so to me, it was like, let's just take whatever the brain initiative is doing and whatever they've figured out, let's apply it to the placenta. So think about big things. So what is an idea? An idea is simply a connection between two pieces of information or knowledge. The issue is that you've got to have those two pieces of information to make that connection. So how can you do that? And this gets to a little bit of what we talked about this morning and last night. Some of it is you need time, and you need time for your brain to incubate, but you also need the substrate. So you have to plan it. You have to plan that you are going to increase your knowledge and increase the information. And you have to plan time to allow you to get there. And one of my colleagues, who's probably one of the most innovative people I know and has done a lot of great. He loved that hour commute. I'm like, I would never want an hour commute. That would be terrible. For him, that was the time when he would be putting his thoughts together and plan things. So I'm not going to encourage anyone an hour commute, but if you do have one, then say, this is great that I have an hour commute because I can reflect on things. So you've got to get that information, put it in your brain, and keep it there so that you can make those connections. Your brain is your intellectual cooker or your idea incubator. And as we talked about last night, serendipity definitely comes into play, right? Sometimes things just happen. And you're doing, in the lab, you know, we shared a PCR machine with a bunch of other labs. And so we would be waiting for the machine to run our samples. And often you just kind of like look at, what's the other person doing, right? What gene are they seeing? What is that gene? Oh, that might be relevant to me. And so we would work with other groups to say, okay, if you give me the information on your primers, let me run them on my samples and I'll give, serendipity happens. And you can get some really great things just because of that nature. Has anyone been to Serendipity in New York City? The big frozen hot chocolate? Yeah, it's good, right? Okay, you also need the adjacent possible. And what I mean by that is you need to be somewhere where there's also other people so that you are hearing what they are saying and this critical mass of people who are all kind of just giving their little bits. And you've got to get together with them and hear from them. So your environment, how close you are to others' adjacent possibles, and then you've got to be inspired to want to do this, but you also have to work really hard at it. So there is an element of serendipity, but there's also an element of perspiration and just true hard work. Super hard work, but hard work. Okay. Oh, sorry, I don't know why this happened, but we'll just do that. Okay, so how do you increase that knowledge base? Read, 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 read. You gotta read. You've gotta read. And it doesn't have to be just scientific reading. Sometimes novels provide you inspiration, right? Important to read not just what's in your field, but read other fields' journals as well. And question things, ask about things, interpret things. If something's covered in the UMKC news, some lab that's made some advance, go and talk to them about it. Because maybe something in that can be applied to what you're doing in your work. And then again, of course, question what you do every day, because rarely is there enough evidence to support it, at least in my field. And I'm going to give an example. So, and I apologize for those who were there last night, because I think I went through this last night. So on the top, for those who don't remember, is a fetal heart rate tracing. And let me just tell you, there's really no good evidence behind fetal heart tracings, just putting that out there if someone's interested in something to look at. So the fetal heart is on the top, the uterine contractions are on the bottom. And when I was in training, I worked at Harvard UCLA, Mike Ross was there, and we did a lot of studies on amnioinfusion. And we were looking at amnioinfusion for oligohydramnios and for meconium-stained amniotic fluid. And we noticed that if you did an amnioinfusion, and others noticed, the variable decelerations often would get better. And it didn't always happen, but they often would get better. And so I'm sitting there, and again, a long time ago, you're on call every other to every third day. You're there a lot, and you're seeing this a lot. And so I'm just thinking in my head like, there's no criteria to say when this is going to work and why it's going to work. Can I answer it? Is there a way for me to say, oh, this is why that's working, or this is why it's not? And I said to myself, well, I wonder if I looked at the amount of amniotic fluid beforehand, if that would be predictive, right? So if there's not a lot of fluid, or if there is a lot of fluid, maybe I could figure out which case it's going to work and which case it's not. And so what I did was on whatever, 250 or so amnioinfusions, I would go and do an AF, or an amniotic fluid index, and measure the amount of fluid in a standardized way before each amnioinfusion. And then at that point, it was paper tracing, so I just kind of kept them to the side. And later on, without knowing what the fluid level was, I went back and I characterized what it looked like here and then what it looked like an hour after the amnio infusion and said, you know, did it get better or not? How many variables are there? How's the tracing? What category is it, et cetera? And what I found was that you did not have a lot of fluid to begin with. If you put fluid in, the tracings got better. Now that seems really simple, but it was known. And if you had a ton of fluid, your success rate was incredibly small, right? Makes sense. Adding more fluid doesn't. And you had a higher rate of tight nuchal cords and true knots in the cord. Not that you're going to clinically do something different, but at least you're going to know that like you're going to be clamping and cutting the cord right when the kid comes out because you get the kid out otherwise. And so I presented this at SMFM as a poster one year, and I was so excited because it was like my work, right? I had come up with it. I had done the whole thing, and it was clean and tight. And I remember Charlie Lockwood came up to me. Charlie is now a dean in Florida, and he's like, and I said to him, he's walking by, I know who he is. He has no idea who I am. I'm a resident. And I said, can I tell you about my poster? And he's looking at me like, sure. He's such a nice guy. And I go through the whole thing, and I mean, clearly I'm like super excited about it. And he was like, we didn't know that? I'm like, no. He's like, that's really cool. Yes, yes. And Charlie and I are good friends to this day. Another time, I can give example of taking something constantly doing, right? So shoulder dystocia is when the baby comes out and the head comes out and you can't get the rest of the baby out. Obstetric emergency. Catastrophic. You've got limited time to get this kid out. And we have all these different maneuvers that we try to do. And what's interesting is what I noticed as a resident was sometimes we did all those maneuvers and the kid came out and everything seemed fine, but no one ever wrote shoulder dystocia, right? And sometimes it was only seemed like the harder ones that you wrote it on. And so I was like, you know, there's got to be a more objective way to determine what dystocia was. So my goal with this project as a resident was to time the second and third stages of labor. Time once the head is out, what's the head to body delivery interval? And could you come up with an objective definition for shoulder dystocia? And so I went in and timed, I don't know, 500 or so deliveries, 250 deliveries, and found that half of the times when maneuvers were used, it wasn't documented as a shoulder dystocia. That was interesting. And then we came up with 60 seconds as being the normal, the abnormal head to body delivery interval, which is the average plus 2 standard deviations, and said, okay, well, so this is an objective definition of shoulder dystocia. And what that allowed then, once we had this definition, was all kinds of additional research studies, right? Because once you've done one thing, then you should add on and do the next one and do the next one. So we quantified, prospectively looked at that definition. And then we started doing different maneuvers, like is one maneuver going to be better than another maneuver? And we had a really cool device, which I wish I had done more with, where we could measure we had the biomedical engineer, so we could measure the amount of pressure that we were putting. And then ultimately I wanted to do was to get a measurement on the kid's neck as well. Super cool stuff. So much opportunity. Okay, so come up with ideas, read a lot, let them percolate, drive for a while, come up with your ideas, come up with the preliminary data, publish on the topic, right? Because when you ultimately are going to go for grant funding, they're going to want to see your track record on that topic. So you need to publish on that topic. Develop those skills that you need to be able to do it, demonstrate that you can do it with some preliminary data, and then submit the grant. Okay, good so far? All right, we're going to talk a little bit about anemia now. So I mentioned OB doesn't often have a lot of evidence. We define anemia by the CDC, the WHO, ACOG, from 3 Scandinavian studies in the 1970s and 80s on about 70 women. That's how anemia is defined in pregnant women. It just seemed wrong to me. So I said, well, is this really appropriate? Is this something that is still true? So we decided to take a look at this. So at Parkland, one of our sites at UT Southwestern, we have about 12,000 deliveries a year. That's 30 to 50 babies a day, 2 kindergarten classes a day, more than 10 states is just at Parkland. So in this time period, we had a lot of babies being born, and we decided that we wanted to evaluate what is normal anemia. What is the definition of anemia for our patient population? Our patient population is predominantly Hispanic and predominantly Medicaid. We do have 97% of our patients access prenatal care, 70% in the first trimester, because we have this 10 outlying clinics in places where people live. So that's pretty cool. So we did this study. We took 1,000 women, all were normal. They were not hypertensive, they did not have diabetes, they didn't have any complications. And we figured out what is defined as anemia, and we came up with beautiful graphs. What is less than the 5th centile? What's the definition of anemia in the first trimester, second trimester, and third trimester? Beautiful paper, right? 1,000 patients. This seems pretty good. And then 70 patients from 3 Scandinavian studies, right? Yes, we were resoundingly rejected for this paper. Absolutely rejected. And we were told that we were not representative of the United States. Not to say that 3 Scandinavian studies is representative of the United States, but we were not. So, never accept failure. We have a second hospital, Clements University Hospital. It's the university facility. It's what replaced St. Paul's for any of you who've been to Dallas. We have a little over 2,000 deliveries a year. It is a predominantly insured Caucasian population. So we did the same thing, 1,000 patients at Clements. So 1,000 patients in the public cohort and 1,000 patients in the more likely to be insured cohort, not 100% private. And we came up with what our definition of anemia was, which was slightly different than the Scandinavian women and is beautifully published now in PLOS. Never give up. Just get a medical student, goes to the other hospital, and pulls the data. Who's joining our residency this year, so I'm so excited about that. Okay, so now we've defined anemia. Are we done? No, we're not done. Never done. There's always more. What do you know about postpartum anemia? How likely is a woman who's anemic at the time of delivery and discharge? What's her crit going to be when she comes back in a couple weeks? When do you transfuse her? And so we have what's called an extended care unit, an area off of labor and delivery, where we care for the sickest patients. If you're really ill, that's where you're going to be. And we were doing all of our transfusions there in 2018, 2019, 2020. And I often staffed that unit, and I saw a lot of transfusions, not because we do a lot of transfusions, but because they're all done in this one little unit, and we have a huge volume of deliveries. But still, I'm thinking to myself, like, why are we transfusing this person? And I would get some of the, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, a little bit of the, well, you know, this patient is vulnerable. She's very young. Her crit is low. She's got a new baby at home. She's not going to have great nutrition at home. Let's tank her up so that she doesn't faint when she's getting up, right? Let's put her on a better trajectory. And I thought to myself, well, I get that. I'm good with that. But is it real? Do we need to do that? So at postpartum anemia, and I got my resident, who is now an MFM fellow in St. Louis, and she was really interested. She came up to me at SMFM as a resident and said, you know, I want my own project for next year. And I was like, you go, Lexi. Okay, let's talk about postpartum anemia. And so she said, well, I want to know for that asymptomatic patient who just has anemia, do I need to transfuse them? And so she went and collected for all, and about 30% of our patients had anemia postpartum. And so she looked at the change in hematocrit from the hospital discharge to the initial postpartum visit. And then she wanted to look at, does it matter by if you have other morbidities, if you have chronic hypertension, if you have diabetes, does your rate of rise change? And then the subsequent year, she looked at, well, what if you delivered preterm so you didn't achieve that increase in blood volume that you achieve at term? And what she found was that the rate of rise is about, overall for everyone, is about 8% for our postpartum follow-up, which is a pretty good rate of rise and suggests to me that if your crit is 20 and you're asymptomatic, you're gonna get to 28 within a couple weeks. Yeah, this might be good enough to just, as long as you're fine, not risk that blood transfusion. She also found that it changed if you had chronic hypertension, if you had severe preeclampsia, or if you had diabetes. The rate of rise was less robust. So maybe if you've got a bunch of morbidities, maybe you're gonna have a different transfusion threshold. And then she looked at what was your rate of anemia. So if you were really low, did that make it a more rapid increase versus if you were higher? And you can see that, in fact, those patients whose crits at discharge were between 20 and less than 20 to 30 had the highest hematocrit recovery rate, suggesting that your body is really able to take over. So hematocrit increases by about 8% in that immediate postpartum period, and if you have complications, it's going to be a little bit slower. Our demographics did not affect the hematologic recovery, and most women who have asymptomatic postpartum anemia are going to have a crit of 37 to 39% postpartum follow-up. All right. Are we done yet? No, we're never done. There's always more. We know that anemia is incredibly common in pregnancy, right? What do we tell our pregnant patients? Take iron. Everyone, right? You're supposed to take iron. You're always supposed to take iron. How often do women take iron? I didn't take it. And I think it's, I think it's something that is, it should be easy. It's not particularly expensive, but it's just something that often doesn't happen. And regardless of sociodemographic status, it's not uncommon. So we decided that we would do a study to evaluate in our patient population what happens to your anemia rate if we hand you iron at your prenatal visit. We don't give you a prescription for it. We don't tell you to go. We give it to you as you walk out. We hand you iron. And then each visit, we ask, do you need more iron? Are you taking your iron and do you need more? This is my medical student who's graduating today, Lisa Teely, so I have to change her MS then. And she worked with Lexi on all those other projects, and she said, I want my study. And so we had recognized that anemia was an issue, and we had started this program where we started handing iron. And so we then, this year for SMFM, evaluated the efficacy of handing out, directly dispensing supplements, rather than prescribing or recommending them alone to pregnant women. And how does that impact your anemia rate? It's going to be good? It's going to be good. So on September 25th, 2019, we started handing out iron. Everyone in all of our prenatal clinics and MFM clinic, everyone gets iron. And the cool thing about working in a system at UT Southwestern is that you can do these things where you just start. We will admit it wasn't that easy. We had to convince the pharmacy to do it. And we had to contract with a company to make the iron. Because remember, it's 12,000 women who are going to need a lot of iron pills. So that you can't just order up on Amazon like, hey, can I have some iron for 14,000 women? You can't do that. Then all deliveries, before we started handing out Folivane, iron, to the deliveries, cohort of deliveries where they would have gotten iron in their first trimester, given the timing that we were. So a little bit after that September date. And again, before it, everyone was told to take iron. We recommend everyone take iron. But after, we're actually handing it to them. Over 20,000 bottles of iron were handed out. And that's consistent with about 260 capsules per patient. On average, patients received 3 bottles, which should be sufficient for their pregnancy period. And what we found was that the anemia rate was significantly 8-week lab, which is for us between 28 and 32 weeks, on admission to labor and delivery, and then at time of delivery discharge. So the rate of anemia went down. That's pretty cool. So they're walking in with a better tank. So this is looking at anemia in those different time epochs. On the y-axis is the percentage of anemia, which was defined by our data as a hematocrit of less than 30. And in the gray are the pre-Fulivane, where the rates are higher than in the blue, which is the post-Fulivane. Fulivane is the name of the iron supplement that we were using. We also found blood transfusion for asymptomatic anemia was reduced significantly by 1/3, from 10 per thousand to 6.6 per thousand. What a huge thing to do, to reduce the amount of blood transfusion for asymptomatic anemia. And that's adjusted for all kinds of different things, your age, your race, your BMI, et cetera. So this is a graph that's looking at the hematocrit levels on admission. So you're walking into delivery where we know it's going to be a bloodletting, right? And you can see how that bell-shaped curve in epoch 2, which is the blue, is shifted to the right. And we're able to just move the entire population by just handing out iron. So our hematocrit increased and our rates of anemia decreased with directly dispensed iron supplementation. And blood transfusion for acute blood loss anemia decreased also with this direct dispense of iron supplementation. So to me, the cool thing about coming up in an area, even a boring area like anemia, is there's so much you can do. And there's so much still more to do, right? I mean, we know that anemia is associated with depression. Depression's associated with a lack of breastfeeding, right? So how about if we evaluate all of that now in these two cohorts of patients? So in summary, let me kind of give you some follow-through for things to take home. Number one, pick questions that you can't find the answers to and create that evidence. About what you do, why you do it, what evidence supports it, and likely there's not going to be much. Create that evidence. Write it down. Do the studies. Publish the studies. Fire in the belly is super fun. I have fire in the belly. I've been described as that a couple of times. I also like the idea of relentless restlessness. Just always be striving for more. Always do the right thing and always do your best. What you lack in inspiration, make up in knowledge and skill. Anything you lack can be accomplished with hard work and enthusiasm. Be honest, be humble, and be curious. Read a lot. And as I mentioned last night, write 45 minutes every day. Thank you so much. I think I've left time for questions. Accomplish the objectives. There we go. Okay. I welcome your thoughts and questions. Yeah. Yes.
Would you consider yourself a good writer when you first started out? Is that something that was intrinsically easy for you and gave you great pleasure? Or is that something that you had to develop a special skill set in?
It's a great question. The question for those at St. Luke's, and hello everyone at St. Luke's, did I consider myself a good writer? And I talked about this a little bit yesterday. No, I don't think I was particularly a good writer. For 45 minutes every day. That's all of my mentees get that recommendation. Because writing is a skill, and effective communication is your calling card to the world. So if you can't write, then you're not going to be able to get to where you want to go. So I encourage everyone to write for 45 minutes a day. And it doesn't have to be something scientific. It can be any kind of writing. You can write to your mother. She would love it too. The more writing you do, the better writer you're going to be. And one of the residents who I mentored for his residency, he's now an MFM fellow, I told him this his intern year. I didn't actually think he did it, but he did. And when I research day a couple of months ago, he said to me, "You have no idea how much a better writer I am and how much easier it is to write. And some days, you can write and it's going all right, and some days it's not. But that's okay. You just do 45 minutes. I started that thought with one of my kids. They were writing college application essays. And I said to her, just write for 45 minutes every day this summer on different topics. some days it's gonna be good, some days it's not, but then you're gonna have a lot to work from at the end of the summer. So I don't think I was a particularly good writer. I tell students when they send me what they write, that when I send it back to them in track changes and I've kept one word, all of that red is love, right? And that means I care about that. And with time, you get less, you don't get less love, but you get less edits. I will say that I have the pleasure of writing a article, an editorial each month for Contemporary OB/GYN. So this month, for next month, our issue is on AI in OB/GYN, artificial intelligence. So typically it's, the last day of the month and I'm starting to write this editorial. And I'm thinking to myself, what am I gonna write about? And I said, how about if I see what ChatGPT could do? I'd never done ChatGPT, but I'd heard about it. And I went to ChatGPT, which was teaching one of my other mentees how to run some really complex statistical program that she would just say, how do I do this? And tell her, and she was learning. I was like, okay, that's interesting. So she told me how to get onto ChatGPT, and I said, write a 500-word editorial on artificial intelligence in obstetrics and gynecology. I'm like, 3 nanoseconds later, I get these 500 words. So I put a little paragraph above, and then I say ChatGPT wrote this, right? And then I put a little bit at the bottom. And I send it in. And the copy desk always edits whatever you write. And they give me a lot of love. Sometimes I take and sometimes they don't. They gave very little love on this one. ChatGPT is clearly a much better writer than I am. Don't know if I answered your question, but yeah.
Outstanding talk. I think we can get a video of it to show our students.
Oh, thank you.
Have you ever been in a situation where you reviewed the literature, reviewed the statistics, and found that the current practice, which is the gospel, is untrue? And your colleagues, you wanted to put this in practice, and your colleagues aren't going for it. What would you advise in that circumstance?
Yeah, so the question at St. Luke's. The question is, have I ever evaluated the literature, reviewed it all, and realized that what people are proposing,
what they're doing
is not reflective of the literature? And how do you handle that? And I think that's a lot of the research that's done, right? I mean, I think home uterine activity monitoring, the fetal pulse oximeter, that was all stuff that was actively being done, and the data did not support it. And so on a local level, what we tend to do at UT Southwestern is, even if it's gospel to do this, we study it in our patient population to see, in our patients, is it effective? And I'll give an example for that. It's a unique patient population in that, although very disadvantaged in many ways, 97% access prenatal care.
I'm from Shreveport, so I know you're talking.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
We have a preterm birth rate of 8%. So things that might work somewhere else to prevent preterm birth, we have not found in our population to prevent preterm birth. So UT Southwestern was part of the progesterone trial and the MEAS trial long ago. And before they participated in the trial, then it comes out there's this recommendation. Well, they studied it in their population, right? So they offered it to the women. They studied it and found their birth rate was no good. So then they stopped offering it. Then they studied vaginal progesterone. Do you know how much women hate vaginal progesterone? Studied that. In fact, it just was published as well. It didn't reduce preterm birth. So for me, the only way that I can deal with it is to see it in my own population and to prove the information, prove the answer. But it's hard because people want to do, they're like, this is what's the recommendation. And I get that, but I don't know if the recommendation works in our patient population.
Thank you.
Great question. Yeah.
Thanks for your wonderful talk. I really appreciate it. And Betty Dries says hi.
Oh.
I think that you had a great deal of value in talking about career and career advancement in multiple aspects. One question I had was, and I think maybe that's, you were saving it for another talk, is the importance of mentorship and how has it changed in our modern day era? And what advice you can give to the students and residents, other junior faculty in that regard?
Absolutely. So the question relates to mentorship. How has it changed in the current environment, and what are my recommendations and guidance? And I wish you'd been there this morning. We had a great long talk about mentorship this morning. Mentorship is incredibly important. And the advent of Zoom and Teams and et cetera has just increased the ability to be able to do this virtually. So I think it's really important not only to have mentors where you are, but also to have mentors who are at different institutions. And I mentor a number of people across the country, around the world, who I have no vested interest in what happens to, right? I mean, I want them to do well, but I have no vested interest in the institution, right? And so I can give an honest assessment of, this would be my recommendation, do with what you wish. But it frees you from being concerned about what's happening at the local level. That said, you've got to have mentors at the local level as well, because these are the people who are going to raise you up and empower you and make those connections for you that are going to be so important for your career. What I tell my mentees is happy to mentor you, but it's a two-way street, right? And I can be the one making certain that you are on my calendar. And it may be that like you're on my calendar and something happened and I'm not, well, get another appointment, right? Because it's a two-way street and you don't want me destining your life because I didn't realize that we haven't met, right? I want my mentees to be committed to the relationship. I want them to have a regular meeting with me, usually every 2 weeks, sometimes every, because that keeps us both accountable, right? And I want them to come with an agenda of what is it that we're going to talk about. Always end every meeting with, how can I help you? What else do you need? And I encourage my mentors to be the same, to hold their people accountable, to explain what is the goal, right? And every once in a while, you've got to revisit what is the goal that that person is after, because sometimes it changes. And to really enjoy the relationship, because there's really nothing better in the world than to lift people up and to see where it can go and what they can accomplish. Yeah.
If you, with respect to the research process and leaving out politics within the institution or otherwise, and IRB, for example, what have the most in completing a research project or convincing people that it's important?
Well, I think it's key when you're doing a research project that you and the group have equipoise and have buy-in, right? So if you want to do something like the iron thing, not everyone understands or agrees, then you're not going to be able to implement such a project, right? So you've got to have the buy-in. You've got to have the equipoise that everyone agrees it's an important question to answer. And I think it all draws back to communication, right? To ensure that we're all on the same page. And then really key to me is to update on a regular basis. How are we doing on these different studies? And to hold each of us accountable for, if it's a recruitment study, where do we stand? Let's look at the recruitment graph. And for people just to say, oh no, it's fine. It's like, no, let's look at it, because the more you look at it, the more you put eyes on it, the better it's going to go, and the better you're going to be able to address any issues that you are facing. And I find by having a regular research meeting set in stone with all of the team members, really, and especially if you can have multiple different projects discussed, you learn from each other and you do a better job. Did that answer your question? Sort of?
Sort of.
Yeah.
Three. Okay. So the first is, how did you pay for the iron?
So, great question. Iron's blood transfusions are expensive.
Sure.
That's good. So we did a business case with the hospital. And I guess in 2015, Parkland changed the prenatal vitamins that they handed out from a multivitamin that included iron to one that was just with folic acid. So they handed folic acid out, which is important. Neural tube defects don't want those. And so what I did was I looked at the hematocrit and the rate of transfusion in 2011 when we were handing things out, and in 2017 when we weren't, and showed them how they were way more anemic and what number of transfusions went up, how much a transfusion costs, which is more than the blood, it's the IV, it's the time, it's the this, it's the that, and got them to buy in that by providing iron, you would win.
Really? You're still giving it?
Mhm.
And my third question is,
That was an easy question.
yes,
Thank you.
Dr. Spong in 1998 was finishing fellowship?
I think so.
Yeah, it looks like she was. So, understanding and appreciating that, no regrets, the learning is repetition. What would you tell 1996 Dr. Spong, 1997 Dr. Spong, and 1998 Dr. Spong, looking back?
Believe in yourself. Always do the right thing. And always do your best. No regrets. Whatever decision you make is the right one. Believe in yourself. Always do the right thing. And always do your best.
Thank you.
Of course. Yeah.
I have a question for people who may not have necessarily research projects or things that they're working on, but are wanting to build a profile. What opportunities for writing would you recommend for them?
Right, so the question is if someone's not doing active research
Or not yet?
at the moment, and they someday may want to, and they are going to start writing because it's a good thing to do, what should they write about? So I think there's lots of opportunity there, right? So this is where I would read an article in a different journal and then kind of write about how do you think that might apply to OBGYN, right? Or what did I learn in that article? Or what are the questions that I have from that article? And then what are the next steps? And you could start just down a process of learning and discovery, which is something that I think we forget about sometimes, the power of learning, the power of new things. And by constantly reading and then writing about what you've learned, you're going to make those connections and make the next steps. And write your mother. As a mom of 4, I can say that. Yeah.
Piggybacking off the mentorship, and do you think the mentorship relationship always has to be formal, or is there room for an informal where it hasn't been arranged? Or do you suggest always being formal?
So the question relates to mentorship, and does it always need to be a formal program, or can it be an informal thing? You're going to have tons of different mentors in your life. Some are going to be formal mentors, and some are just going to be people that you bounce things off of. For those who really are important to your career, you're going to want that to be a formal thing, right? Because you're going to want to ensure that you both are vested in the relationship. Informal mentoring to me is more of kind of a hit once, and then a couple months later you ask another question. But it's not something where you are both giving to that relationship necessarily. So I think there's definitely room for both, but you're going to want for certain some formal mentors, and they will change over time. Some will stay with you for life, some come in and out, and that's okay. Your interests are going to change. And your mentors are also really important for you to make the connections that you need to make that only can be done because they know the person, right? So I think one of the fortunate byproducts of the career that I have had is I know a lot of people, right? And so I can say, someone's like, well, da-da-da. I'm like, oh, well, why don't we just call Dr. So-and-so and, see what they think. But it's just because I'm lucky that I know that person, right? But your mentors are going to know a lot of people. And it's a way for you to make those connections and get to know your next mentors. Yeah. Yes.
How do you deal with the effect of politicians impinging on an area that you base evidence and method the same point of view that?
Yeah, so how do I deal with politics and I'll say politics in general, and we talked a little bit about that this morning, that you don't really get a good sense when you're training to become a doctor or even as a resident, the influence of politics on everything that we do, whether it's internal politics in the university or it's external politics. And certainly living in DC and working with the government, there was, every 4 years, it was an interesting time for what you could or what you could not do. I will say that this is probably, maybe they always say this, but to me, this is a really hard time to be a leader in OBGYN. It's a really, really hard time to be a leader in OBGYN in Texas. And a program that's delivering 12,000 babies, so if something goes wrong, we're going to be the first ones to see it. It's a hard time to be a leader in OB-GYN. And so you've got to navigate that in a way that is evidence-based, true to yourself, always do the right thing, and do the right thing for your faculty. And so that has been very difficult to walk that walk. We are very evidence-based, so we publish on what we see and just let that speak for itself. Yeah.
But I think you're quite extraordinary in terms of how you've led your faculty, and you're not giving us the whole picture within, this is, I think, what, we're honored that you're here and the talk has been amazing, but this piece of how you lead is extraordinary. So in the state of Texas, with all the constraints on delivering a baby at 18 weeks with ruptured membranes, where this can be regarded as a felony in your state, you've chosen personally to do all those deliveries.
Up until our paper was published, yes.
Wow, that's great.
That is a leader.
It is
Yeah,
weird.
that's right.
I mean,
It seemed the right thing to do. I try to do the right thing at all times and to be true to myself, and I did not wish to put my faculty at risk.
I think it's amazing. I know as a leader that I've always thought about leading by example, but that is one of the most extraordinary examples of leadership that I think I've known in my career. So I just wanted to put it out there. I think that is wonderful, and then publishing on it. Do you want to mention the publication and what that?
So, yeah, we published on our experience of the first 28 patients who we managed to the best of our ability and demonstrated the morbidity associated with that, which is an accepted standard way to care for patients, but can be incredibly cause complications. And published on that, and it's such an interesting time. I am a UT employee, so I have constraints on how I say things and what I say, but it is a remarkable place to work, the support that we have and the support given to us to be allowed to publish and to demonstrate what the impact is has been remarkable.
So you laid the foundation for how you move forward there then too.
It's leading by example is really important, I think, and it goes to even in COVID, you go in every day and you take care of those patients, and we be on the labor floor and do the right thing, and how do you transition then to the post-COVID pandemic as a leader, and how do you get the buy-in from your faculty and staff who now have experienced different ways of living from COVID, and to buy into the camaraderie and to the teamwork and to the sense of belonging when you still have people doing remote work. It's a really extraordinary time to be a leader. It's really hard.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.